Well, the results of the past year have been truly tremendous. I believe that the announcement of these results would be met with surprise and excitement around the world. A bright future would come into light, and our efforts, our country's resourcefulness, would surely be known in every land. Improved standards of living, delicious food, and a variety of entertainment gathered from countries around the world all promised a fun and interesting life, something that was unthinkable when I had just reincarnated as a slime. I could fairly devote myself to my hobbies if only we didn't have a problem with the Eastern Empire. It suddenly occurred to me that Veldora and I, along with volunteers, could declare war and immediately invade the Empire. I've heard that if we developed civilization too quickly, an army of angels would rain down and attack, but we didn't even know where they came from. Therefore, it'd be hard for us to launch a preemptive strike, but the Empire was a different story. Since they're openly preparing to attack us, they can't complain if we barge in first. That was what I'd thought. Waiting wasn't in my nature, and no matter how you looked at it, attacking would be easier for us than defending. If what the Empire sought after was the annexation of the Western nations, then there was no reason for them to invade the Great Jura Forest. They could always choose to ignore us. Veldora's resurrection was already well known, and a little research would reveal that antagonizing me meant making an enemy out of Veldora as well. The ball was in the Empire's court. Yet, this situation was giving us a considerable amount of stress. How about we consider the possible routes for invading the Western nations? First off, a sea invasion was impossible. Considering the attacks of the great sea creatures, even if they prepared a large number of dreadnought-class battleships, safety wasn't guaranteed. Fighting in the domain of gigantic aquatic monsters was too risky to be an option. It wasn't even clear if they could safely navigate the ocean. The conditions would be miserable for knights if they were forced to battle on the sea, as they'd have to deal with the rocking of the waves. Furthermore, another question arose. Just how many ships would they need to amass if they wished to transport a large number of soldiers? If they planned to send soldiers in the tens of thousands to the kingdom of Feminas, Yaum's side wouldn't be standing idly by. They were prepared to defend themselves and meet the enemy in battle. As long as they couldn't establish a beachhead in the first wave, it'd be impossible for the Empire to send reinforcements. Imposing sea beasts behind them and the kingdom of Feminas in front. If that happened, the morale of the Empire's troops would plummet, and it'd be as good as a tactical victory for our side. Thus, another question arose. Ignoring Feminas, could they use a different approach by invading northern Ingratia? The conclusion was that it would also be challenging. Ingratia's northern border was the playground of demons. He didn't seem too keen on keeping his subordinates in check, and Testaros's men were now in charge of its defense. It was a constant battleground for belligerents, and if the Empire were to invade, then they could expect to become a target of opportunity. Therefore, an attack via the sea was unfeasible. Next, you had to consider a land invasion. They needed to take a route through the Dwarven Kingdom or cross the Dragon Roost in the Canid Mountains. The latter possessed too great a risk, so it'd be discarded as an option. After all, marching at an altitude higher than Mount Everest would be suicidal, regardless of how well prepared you were. It would be impractical for them to train ordinary soldiers into mountain climbing experts, and even if they did, a group of dragons, who were A-rank monsters, would be waiting for them. Common sense dictated that no one would be stupid enough to choose this route. Then, what about going through the Dwarven Kingdom? When this possibility was pointed out by Wisdom King Raphael-san, Hinata investigated it in my stead, and she confirmed that it was theoretically possible for a large army to pass through. However, Gazel wasn't someone who would ever permit this, and if the Empire forced their way through, then they would need to battle the Dwarven Kingdom before they could face the Western nations. The invasion of the Dwarven Kingdom was as reckless as it sounded. The armed nation of Dworgen, who declared neutrality, had a highly trained standing army to guarantee their security. Their armaments, which made full use of their technological prowess, were simply exceptional, and it was said that the dwarves had no weak soldiers among them. To begin with, based on its topography, the Dwarven Kingdom was built like a fortress. If they just protected their entrances, they could stave off any attack, even one by an enormous army. Eastern, Western, and Central among these three entrances, if the Empire were to invade, they would choose either Eastern or Central. Western was connected to the kingdom of Feminas, so they wouldn't have to worry about that. Eastern was the most dangerous and at risk, since it shared a border with the Empire, but as expected, Gazel was nothing but prepared. He'd been concentrating the bulk of his forces in this area in order to keep an eye on the Empire's movements. If something were to happen, I planned on quickly responding to their call for aid, and the Dwarven Kingdom was also safe in Gazel's hands. This was the current situation surrounding our country. In the end, I felt that the Empire's only option was to go through the Great Jura Forest. Before my meeting with Benimaru, which had become a daily routine, I went through these same plans once more. In case they chose the Great Jura Forest route, which we defended, it was obvious that the greatest obstacle, from the Empire's perspective, was Veldora's existence. They wouldn't attempt a frontal assault, so they'd probably try to trick Veldora by preparing a decoy unit. With that in mind, I had to consider our country's defensive setup. There were 3 possible routes for initiating military operations within the Great Jura Forest. However, one of them was adjacent to Dworgen's territory. If the Empire ignored our warning and came to invade, the Dwarven Kingdom and our army could catch them in a pincer attack. The Empire would definitely be aware of how dangerous this option was, so I think it's fine to set a lower alert level. It was more likely that the Empire would strike by using one of the 2 remaining routes. But is it really that straightforward? It was a bad idea to split your forces when facing a large enemy, so we could deploy Veldora on one side and our full army on the other. If we employed this tactic, then we should be able to handle the Empire, even if they prepared a diversionary force. Even I, who was by no means an expert in military affairs, could formulate something like this. Thus, I had my doubts that professional soldiers would set out to war with such a simple strategy. There was also the possibility that the Empire was looking down on us, thinking that with an overwhelmingly massive army, they could trample over us, regardless of Veldora or our monster army. On the other hand, perhaps they would utilize an underhanded strategy instead of facing us head-on. For instance, they could use the regular army as bait and initiate guerrilla warfare with elite troops in small groups. What if they split into platoon-sized units in order to infiltrate the forest and then regroup somewhere else? In these cases, it'd be impossible to monitor all of the minor trails throughout the woods. If we carelessly deployed a reconnaissance force, depending on the scale of the enemy, it might come back to haunt us. Just like what Hinata had done before if a platoon of Holy Knight-level troops were dispatched. If we took that prospect into account, there wouldn't be enough troops to cover all possible incursions. It was risky if we moved to intercept the Empire after determining their objective, so I wanted to avoid that as much as possible. And if we lost the initiative, there was the chance that we'd fall into an unrecoverable position. Although we were trying to be vigilant for that exact reason, the crux of the matter was that we couldn't read the Empire's movements. In war, the more unpredictable you were, the bigger the advantage you held over your opponent. Oftentimes, making an unexpected move would be enough to clinch a victory. As a result, we had to consider every single possible scenario. It's no use. My mind's going in circles. I became irritated when those thoughts bubbled up. Wouldn't it really be better for me to attack first? Or rather, wouldn't attempting a blitzkrieg, the moment the Empire declared war, be the correct answer? Since we couldn't guarantee that the Empire would move according to our predictions, it was pointless to dwell further on this subject. No matter how many times I thought it over, I felt that launching a preemptive strike was the rational thing to do, rather than waiting for an opponent to make their move. We wouldn't be overwhelmed with worries and could seize the initiative. Well, I wouldn't do it. No matter how long I mulled it over, the perfect answer wouldn't drop from the sky. It was smart to be flexible about these things. In other words, playing it by ear. Somehow, it sounded cool and gave the impression of a capable man. Right, let's do that. Having reached my usual conclusion, I grabbed the cream puffs that Shuna had prepared. All this hard thinking gave me a craving for sweets. Although some claim you would get sick of having too much of the same thing, that it never happened to me. Well, if that ever did happen to me, I might reconsider. Hey, eating them alone is so unfair. While I was in the middle of enjoying my cream puffs with Xian's black tea, Benimaru finally arrived. We were in my office. He was a little late to our meeting, which somehow had become a routine. He must have been extremely busy, given that he was in charge of war preparations against the Empire. Complaining about tardiness would have been quite petty of me. What? Help him? I have no idea what you're saying. If you aren't an expert, you're better off leaving it alone. I know, awfully convenient of me to say. Xian, pour Benimaru some black tea, too. Understood. Benimaru seemed to have been traumatized by Xian's cooking, and as a result, always wore a wary expression. It was okay if it was just black tea, but still, his cautious attitude never faded, very typical of him. Thank you. Nothing like a couple sweets to get you going again. Well, good thing we've got sugar to spare. It'd be nice if this peace continues. Right. I guess if a decisive battle were to come, we could just beat them and call it a day. Benimaru's confidence was as strong as ever. Although reliable, I hope he didn't forget to make an effort to avoid war as the first option. Enjoy. Xian placed a cup of black tea in front of Benimaru. She poured some more for me too. It had a wonderfully relaxing scent. What about Diablo? Benimaru asked. Ah, he has another day of arbitration. Again? Yeah, again. Yep, Diablo was out mediating. Ultima and Carrera got into a spat every single day. It wasn't that they didn't get along, but rather they tried to compete with each other in any way, shape, or form. Yesterday, it was about the extradition of criminals, and before that was the treatment of suspects in custody. Sometimes they'd fight over the food menu, and other times they'd argue about who should buy the latest fashion clothes first. Everything would be fine if it were just a verbal debate, but when those two fought, their ferocity could surprise even the Yakuza. Only Diablo could stop those ruthless perpetrators. Venom, who was Diablo's subordinate, was already a victim, having been abused both verbally and physically by Ultima and Carrera. No damage had thankfully been inflicted upon the town's residents, and in fact, it had actually become famous enough to lead people to make bets, but it was still a problem that we couldn't turn a blind eye to. That was the reason why I had Diablo sort things out, but it might be time to think of a permanent solution. Otherwise, the situation might change for the worse. I could already feel that Diablo was going to snap sooner or later. Speaking of which, Diablo took Ultima and Carrera to the labyrinth a few days ago. He was brimming with enthusiasm, not because of something fun and sweet such as a date, but about the thought that he was going to give them a thorough scolding. He took advantage of the fact that you couldn't die in the labyrinth and beat them up without mercy, yet it appeared that they hadn't learned their lesson at all. On the contrary, they were rather eager to fight Diablo. Why are the demons so bellicose? Personally, I couldn't keep up with them. While I was having a brief chat with Benimaru, Diablo suddenly came in, looking utterly exhausted. "I'm sorry to keep you waiting." "Oh, thanks for the hard work," I replied. No, it's barely enough to warrant calling it hard work, it's just that my time with Rimuru-sama has. You don't seem tired, so let's get down to business. Alright. Well, if you can spare the energy to talk nonsense, then I suppose you're okay. Diablo wanted to say something, but it'd just wind up being his usual soliloquy anyway. Putting that aside, Benimaru and I decided to start today's meeting.